I had not planned to stay more than a week, but Peter's silent glances made me feel uneasy. The strange tension in the air made me want to stay longer. At first, I thought it was nothing important, but maybe it was just my daughter being restless or Peter being quiet. But I was also curious. I could tell that Peter was paying more attention to me than Lydia ever did. He noticed when I was busy, and he would look at me for a little bit longer than was usual. We would look at each other over coffee or in the kitchen window. I was curious about Peter. Lydia never showed that much attention, but he did. He noticed when I was busy. We sometimes looked at each other over coffee or through the window. Lydia, my daughter, always seemed busy with her work and school. I thought about if she knew about the problems in our family. Maybe she trusted her husband and mother too much. One nice fall day, she left. On a warm autumn evening, Lydia suddenly left because of a last-minute call. Peter looked at me with warmth that I had not felt in years. In that short, silent moment, the difference between family and an unspoken feeling became blurred. I decided that it would be the end there. I told myself that there was nothing wrong with being attracted to him, and I ignored it. But then, a quick look changed everything. As I got off the train, I put my coat on. It had been almost a year since I had last seen Lydia and Peter, and it felt like a lifetime since I lived with them. Lydia, my daughter, had always been independent. She had a life with Peter that didn't need me, and I really liked that. But recently, her calls had been more often, and he sounded tired and annoyed. Mom had urged him to come stay with us for a while. When Peter greeted me at the station, his voice had a new tone. I noticed a change in him, too. He looked older, like the year had put a little strain on him. I thought she sounded tired and upset. Come stay with us for a while, Mom, she had urged. When Peter greeted me at the station, I noticed a change in him, too. He looked older, like the year had put a little strain on him. I thought it was probably from his job as a civil engineer, which meant long hours, complicated plans, and checking things out on site. He greeted me warmly, but he looked tired. He was still polite, but there was something else in his eyes. They had a little more intensity. He was tired and didn't want to talk about it. You look wonderful, Vivian, he said as he took my suitcase. I felt flattered. The trip from the station was calm. We talked a little bit, but not too much. Peter sometimes looked at me, as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. I don't know who you are, but you look great, Vivian, he said, trying to be flattering. Thank you, I replied, feeling a little embarrassed. The trip from the station was calm. Peter sometimes looked in my direction, as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. When we arrived at the house, Lydia was on the phone, moving her hands around without really paying attention. Then she went to her office. I knew that her job as a business consultant took up most of her time, but I hadn't expected her to just disappear as soon as I got there. Peter laughed when he saw how surprised I was. He said, I'm used to Lydia being like this all the time. Lydia was on the phone, gesturing distractedly, before going into her office. I knew she was a business consultant, but I didn't know why she was on the phone. Peter laughed when he saw me looking surprised. He said that Lydia is always talking on the phone and doesn't notice anything else around her. I smiled at what he said. He said that Lydia is like her father because when she's focused on something, she doesn't notice the world around her. Peter looked at me in a different way, and I felt like we had a special connection. Lydia and I were often absorbed in our own concerns. As Peter guided me to the guest room, I sensed that familiar undercurrent once more. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but the day had settled into a routine that was reassuring in its simplicity. Lydia and Peter would leave for work early, while I enjoyed the solitude of the mornings. As I went to the guest room, I felt a familiar feeling. I tried to ignore it. Lydia and Peter would leave for work early, and I liked being alone in the morning. Lydia was often tired from reading and preparing meals in the evenings. This made her want to leave early, while Peter and I stayed at the dinner table and drank wine. We talked easily. Peter was smart and funny. He told me things about himself that I didn't know. He talked about his work and how good he thought the buildings he had built were. He also talked about how good it felt to solve difficult problems. I liked how smart he was and how careful he was. Sometimes, during our talks, he would look at me. One evening, as the sun set and long shadows were cast over the kitchen, I found myself leaning in, eager for more. He stood in the doorway, watching me slice vegetables. We were silent, and his intense gaze created a special atmosphere. Vivian said in a voice almost above a whisper, "Thank you for being here." I didn't realize how much I needed to talk to someone. I put the knife down and looked at him. His words hung in the air between us. I couldn't understand them, and I said, "Peter, I'm happy to be here." "I'm glad to be here," I said, trying not to blush. Lydia suddenly appeared, her usual cheerful energy filling the room. She interrupted us. I looked back at the cutting board, hoping she hadn't noticed how close we'd been getting during the week. As our friendship grew, we enjoyed calm mornings together. While Lydia was still asleep, we drank coffee and looked at each other over our mugs. We didn't say much, but our silence conveyed more than words. There was an unspoken understanding, a tenderness in Peter's gaze that made me feel both reassured and disturbed. I hadn't felt this way in years. This subtle exhilaration felt new to me. I was happy just to be acknowledged. The morning after Lydia left for work, I saw Peter alone in the garden. He was fixing a broken fence. He looked up as I got closer. With a shy smile, he said, "I didn't expect you to be awake this early," staring at the sun. The next morning, I saw Peter in the garden. He was fixing a broken fence. He looked up when he heard me coming. He smiled and said, "I didn't expect you to be awake this early." I couldn't sleep. I was staring at the sun, which was still low in the sky. I couldn't sleep. I crossed my arms to keep the cold out. We stood there for a while. We watched the leaves shake in the light wind. We felt calm and familiar, like we had shared these moments for years. I reached out to remove a. I couldn't sleep, so I sat with my arms crossed, trying to stay warm in the cold. We stood there for a while, watching the leaves shake in the wind. It felt peaceful, like we had been through this many times before. I touched his shoulder to get a speck of dirt off, but my hand kept going for a second too long. I looked up, and we looked at each other. He started to say something, but he stopped. I took my hand away, cleared my throat, and said, "I'll make breakfast. Lydia will wake up soon." He said that. His voice sounded like that. I touched a speck of dirt on his shoulder. I looked up, and our eyes met. He started to speak, but he stopped. I took my hand away and coughed. "I must prepare breakfast. Lydia will wake up soon." He said that it was probably a good time that evening. I sat across from Lydia, who looked tired. She hardly looked up from her plate. She and Peter had barely said a few words, and the quiet between them was obvious. I wanted to ask if everything was okay and if she was happy, but I didn't. I didn't want to bother her later. When Lydia went to bed early, Peter and I were alone again this time. We were attracted to each other. We sat in silence, and the clock on the wall ticked. It felt like we were suspended in time. After doing that, Peter and I were alone again. We were attracted to each other. It wasn't just a coincidence. We sat in silence. The clock on the wall ticked. It made us feel like we were in a different world. Peter sometimes thought about his glass. He wondered if this was all there was. If we were just supposed to deal with the same old routine every day. I watched him. I felt sad. "Peter, you are young. You have a lot of potential." I saw him sitting there, thinking about life, and wondering if there's more to it than just getting through each day. I thought, is this all there is? Are we just supposed to deal with the same old routine? And, is it enough? I watched him, and I felt sad for him. "Peter, you're young and have a lot of potential. But sometimes, I'm not sure. I wonder if I made some mistakes in how I looked at him." I saw something in his eyes that made me feel honored, but also scared. I wanted to help him, but I saw that any time I tried to, it just made things worse. I didn't know what to do. I was sitting there with my hands clasped in my lap, and I could tell that he was really sad. "I should go," I said eventually, when I felt my throat tighten up. I realized that he was barely able to hear me when I stood up, and he looked at me for a long time. I decided to leave. I felt sad and I was holding my hands in my lap. I felt like I was carrying his sadness with me. I should go home. I felt like I was going to cry. When I stood up, I felt like he was looking at me. I felt like he was happy to see me. Every day, we got closer. We got to know each other through small things that we did. I felt like I was attracted to him. I liked that he was strong, kind, and lonely. He was like a part of me that I had never known before. But every time Lydia came into the room, the magic disappeared. I tried to hide my feelings and follow the rules, but the more I did that, the more I wanted him. One night, I thought about how far I was willing to go. One evening, after Lydia left for another late call, Peter touched my hand. He wanted to get a drink, but he was being subtle. Our eyes met, and I felt a shudder. I realized that we were more than friends. The next day, over the next few days, Peter and I kept glancing at each other over coffee. Our eyes met, and it felt like we were acknowledging something deeper, something fragile and temporary that we both sensed but didn't talk about. I told myself that this feeling was just temporary and not dangerous, and that we were still the same. But every day, I found myself more and more interested in the nice moments we had together, like how he listened so well, and how he seemed. One afternoon, Peter came in as I was folding laundry. He had his sleeves rolled up and looked relaxed, like he hadn't in a long time. He asked if I needed help, and I said no and smiled. I have been folding clothes for a long time. I've become very skilled at it, he said, grinning against the door frame. Sometimes, the clothes don't matter, you just want to be with someone. There was something about the way he spoke that made my hands stop moving. The fabric fell from my grasp as I looked up at him. He was calm, but his eyes, I've mastered it, he said, smiling against the door frame. Sometimes, the way you dress isn't as important as being with the right person. His voice made my hands stop moving. I looked up at him, and his calm attitude was different from the intensity in his eyes. Peter, I'm here, I said, but my voice got quiet because I was nervous. He came closer, and his eyes didn't change. Vivian, I'm not sure if this feeling is wrong or just because I'm alone. I was eager to spend time with you. You make the room feel special. I wanted to laugh and act like I didn't care, but I felt the same way. It felt like the house was different when he was there. It felt more welcoming, but also a little less exciting. I looked forward to spending time with you. You make the room feel special. I wanted to laugh and act like I didn't care, but I felt the same way. The house felt different when he was there. It was more inviting, but also less exciting. I realized he was hiding a strong feeling. He was afraid to show it, and I knew that would change everything. I took a deep breath and chose my words carefully. Peter, I think we both change over time. It's easy to feel this way when you're. I understood that he was hiding a deep feeling because he was afraid to show it. I knew that knowing this would change everything. I took a deep breath and chose my words carefully. Peter, I think we are both drifting in our own ways. It's easy to feel this way when you don't have something important. He whispered, his voice barely above a whisper, but that didn't make it any less real at that moment. Lydia's voice came from downstairs, interrupting the magic. Peter stepped back, running a hand through his hair to calm down. I forced a smile, folding the shirt in my hands. Lacking something significant, he whispered, although it was still clear what he meant. Lydia's voice came from downstairs, disrupting the moment. Peter stepped back, running a hand through his hair to regain his composure. I forced a smile, folding the shirt in my shaky hands. This made my heart slow down. Lydia looked between us, her eyes narrowing slightly. Did I interrupt something? Peter shook his head quickly, offering her a comforting smile while helping your mother with the washing. Lydia's gaze fell on us just before she shrugged, unaware. Lydia's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked between us. Did I interrupt something? Peter shook his head and smiled at her, trying to comfort her. She looked at us, and then shrugged, unaware of the tension between us. Dinner is almost ready. I felt it was important to tell you both as she left. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I looked at Peter briefly, feeling a bit guilty. Whatever was happening between us was becoming more and more difficult to hide. Lydia left early the next morning for a work trip, so she would be out of town overnight. She had been planning for it for several weeks. She was very excited as she packed her luggage, talking about the clients she would visit and the presentations she would give. Lydia left early in the morning for a work trip. She was excited about it and had been planning for it for several weeks. As she packed her bags, she talked about the clients she would visit and the presentations she would give. She hardly acknowledged me or Peter as she said her farewell and left the house for the first time since I arrived. Peter and I were definitely alone. The house had a different, calmer feeling, as if it were holding its breath with May spent the day doing small jobs, such as folding towels and dusting the shelves. I did a few small things around the house to keep my hands busy and think about what was going on. By the time it got dark, I was really stressed. Peter suggested we have a simple meal on the patio. He had bought some bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine for a special occasion. It was a nice evening. The sky changed color, and it was cool outside. The sky changed color to soft purple and pink as the sun went down. We sat there, enjoying the wine and talking. We talked about memories, regrets, and goals we had forgotten. I learned that Peter had a special bottle of wine for a special occasion. As the sun set, the sky turned a soft purple. We sat in the fading light and drank wine. We started talking about our lives. I told him things I had not told anyone in years. I felt comfortable telling him these secrets. I asked him if he ever thought about the life he was supposed to live. He nodded. I slowly shook my head. I think about the decisions I've made and the other paths I could have taken, wondering if I would be a different person and happier. I see the sadness in your eyes, and I feel my own sadness. We all have regrets, but maybe. He looked thoughtful, and his eyes reflected my own sadness. We all have regrets, but it's never too late to find something better. He looked at me, his hand resting on mine. His touch made me shiver, and his presence made me feel better. Vivian said something quietly. He spoke softly and steadily. I don't know what this is, but it feels more real than anything I felt in a long time. My breath hitched, and the weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I knew that what he was saying, what he was feeling, was something we couldn't act on, something that would shatter the lives we built, if we let it. But in that moment, with the world falling away around us, it was hard to care about anything other than the man sitting across from me. As the night grew darker, we found ourselves sitting closer, the space between us shrinking with each passing second. I could feel his warm breath. We built lives, but if we let it, the trip was cancelled at the last minute. Peter, can you believe it? It was hard to care about anything other than the man sitting across from me. As the night grew darker, we found ourselves sitting closer. The space between us was getting smaller with each passing second. I could feel his breath warm against my cheek. His hand lingered on mine, and I knew that if I leaned forward just a little, just an inch or two, everything would change. But before either of us could cross that invisible line, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. We both jerked back, our hands slipping apart as I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. Vivian, I began, but I couldn't finish. The front door opened, and Lydia walked in. She looked tired but happy. Surprised, she called out, laughing as she dropped her bags by the door. The trip was cancelled at the last minute. Can you believe it, Peter? Vivian, I was very nervous. The front door opened, and Lydia walked in. She looked tired but happy. She laughed as she dropped her bags by the door. The trip was cancelled at the last minute. Can you believe it, Peter and I, she said. I looked at Peter, and we smiled. Our smiles were forced. She didn't seem to notice. She was excited about her unexpected return. She didn't notice the tension that filled the house when she was gone. She started talking about her day. I left. I went to the guest room to rest. My heart was beating very fast. I had many thoughts and feelings. I knew that something had happened between Peter and me that night. It had changed something forever between us. But I also knew that I shouldn't be mad at Peter. I couldn't bring myself to regret it that night. I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, my mind replaying the evening over and over. I thought about the warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, and the quiet yearning that seemed to pass between us in every glance. I knew I should feel ashamed, that I should try to put distance between us. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, and the quiet yearning that seemed to pass between us in every glance. I knew I should feel ashamed, that I should try to put distance between us for Lydia's sake. But the thought of losing that connection, of going back to a life without that feeling, was almost unbearable. The next morning, I rose, hoping to avoid both Peter and Lydia as I tried to collect my thoughts. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I found him there, his back to me, as he prepared coffee. I was worried about losing that connection. I didn't want to go back to a life without that feeling. The next morning, I rose, hoping to avoid Peter and Lydia. As I stepped into the kitchen, I found him there, his back to me, as he prepared coffee. He turned when he heard me enter. His expression was soft, and his eyes filled with an unspoken question. "Vivian," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened last night, but I can't stop thinking about it." I swallowed, my heart racing. Neither of us could say anything more. Lydia's voice. He turned when he heard me come in. He looked at me, and his eyes showed that he was confused. "Vivian, I don't know what happened last night, but I can't stop thinking about it. I'm nervous, and my heart is beating fast." Neither of us can say anything more. Lydia's voice called out from upstairs. I looked at Peter, and he looked back at me for a moment, and then he turned away. He poured coffee into 2 mugs as if nothing had happened. As Lydia entered the kitchen, I forced a smile, trying to forget about the night before. I looked up from the table and saw Peter. He was looking at me, but I tried to act like I didn't notice. Lydia came into the kitchen. I smiled, but I knew that we had broken the boundaries we had tried to keep. There was no going back. The morning after Lydia returned, the air felt thick and heavy. I noticed every glance and every word exchanged in the kitchen. Peter and I avoided each other's eyes. We knew Lydia was watching us, and we both felt uneasy. As time went on, I noticed Lydia's gaze often fell on Peter and me, as if she were suspicious of something. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't help but feel that there was more to it. I was aware that Lydia was watching us, and I felt like she was being a bit too obvious about it. As time went on, I noticed that Lydia's gaze often fell on Peter and me, as if she were picking up on something strange. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, but Lydia was observant, which was a trait she had developed in her career. She could sense that something was wrong, even if she couldn't explain it. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Lydia glanced between Peter and me, her expression thoughtful. Lydia might have noticed something was wrong, even if she couldn't say exactly what it was. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, she looked at Peter and me, her face serious. She tapped her fingers on the table, like she always did when she was a kid. This was a clear sign that her mind was working. Finally, she looked at me. She spoke casually, but her tone was firm. "Mom, have you been enjoying your stay?" I nodded and smiled. "Of course, it's been nice spending time with both of you." She kept her head down, focused on her food, but I could feel the tension radiating from Peter. "It's just you," she said, her gaze sharpening. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I felt my pulse quicken. "Different, how so?" Peter kept his head down, focused on his food, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. "It's just you," she said, her gaze sharpening. I can't quite put my finger on it. I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to maintain composure. "Different how?" She shrugged, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know. Maybe it's nothing. You just seem quieter than usual, and Peter has been distracted." Peter cleared his throat, glancing at Lydia with a strange smile. "I've had a lot on my mind. Work stuff, you know." Lydia's gaze lingered on him, her expression skeptical. "Right, work." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and I felt a cold sweat prickle the back of my neck. Mom seemed quieter than usual, and Peter had been distracted. Peter cleared his throat and looked at Lydia with a strange smile. "I've had a lot on my mind. Work stuff, you know." Lydia's gaze lingered on him. Her expression was skeptical. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Lydia's tone was light, but there was a hint of doubt in her voice. It was as if she wasn't entirely convinced. A few days later, Lydia asked me to join her for lunch. This was a rare invitation, given her busy schedule. She chose a small, quiet cafe downtown. I could tell by the way she fidgeted with her coffee cup and the way her eyes darted around the room that she was thinking about something. "Mom," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wanted to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." We were in a cozy, quiet place where we could talk without interruption. I could tell by the way she fidgeted with her coffee cup and the way her eyes darted around the room that something was on her mind. "Mom, your voice sounds different. Is something wrong?" I nodded, my heart pounding as I braced myself for whatever was coming. "Do you think Peter's happy?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" I tried to keep a neutral expression. "Do you mean that lately he's been distant?" "I feel like he's here, but not really." I nodded, my heart pounding as I prepared myself for whatever was going to happen. "Do you think Peter's happy?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" I tried to keep a neutral expression. "Do cup, lately he's been distant. I feel like he's here, but not really here. Like his mind is somewhere else. I don't know if it's just work or if it's something more," she said, her voice expressing a deep sense of vulnerability. I felt a pang of guilt that I couldn't ignore. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "Lydia, sometimes people go through he's here, but he's not really here. His mind is somewhere else. I don't know if it's just work or if it's something more." Her voice made me feel something deep within me. I felt a strong feeling of guilt. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "Lydia, sometimes people go through things that have nothing to do with the ones they love. Maybe he's just dealing with his own struggles. Maybe he has things he hasn't shared with you yet." She nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. I said, "I don't want to lose him, Mom. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to us." Her words hit me like I felt a wave of shame wash over me. I felt guilty for not knowing what to do. My daughter was confiding in me. She was trusting me with her fears about her marriage. But I was keeping secrets that could tear her world apart. I knew that whatever was happening between Peter and me had to stop. I couldn't let myself be the reason for her problems. I felt ashamed. I was holding secrets that could destroy my daughter's marriage. I knew that I couldn't let myself be the reason for her marriage to crumble that evening. I tried to stay away from Peter. I avoided the quiet moments that had become so tempting, so dangerous. I did things around the house to keep my mind busy and my feelings in check. But despite my efforts, I found myself I tried to stay away from Peter, but I couldn't. I kept busy with household chores to take my mind off things, but I found myself drawn to him. I kept trying to resist, but it was hard. Later, I was putting away dishes in the kitchen when Peter appeared in the doorway. He watched me for a moment, and I couldn't read his expression. Then he stepped closer and said quietly, "We need to talk." I looked away and shook my head. "Peter, Lydia is already suspicious. We cannot continue pretending this is not happening." His touch was warm and soothing. "I understand, but I cannot pretend this is not real. I cannot ignore my feelings." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Peter, we are crossing lines that can't be undone. Lydia is not worthy of this treatment." I understand Peter's response, his voice full of quiet desperation. "But I can't go back to how things were. I feel alive around you, Vivian. I feel like you see me." His words made me nervous, but I told myself to forget it. I realize I don't deserve this treatment. I know he's right, and his voice was full of worry. But I can't go back to how things were before. I feel strong and alive when I'm with you, Vivian. I feel like he's paying attention to me now." His words made me nervous, but I told myself to stop. My hand was covered by the weight of shame, like a thick blanket. "Peter, we need to stop hurting Lydia like this before he can help her." The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and Lydia appeared in the doorway. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at us. Are we getting involved in something that's not our business?" she asked, sounding suspicious. Peter quickly moved away, looking calm but also worried. We were just talking, and then Lydia looked at us for a second before shrugging. "I don't want to stay up late, so I'm going to bed," she said as she walked away. She started to look at us more closely. I felt relieved, but also guilty. I knew that Lydia was watching us, and that the tension between Peter and me was getting worse. If we didn't deal with it soon, it would become obvious that we weren't telling the truth. Lydia's doubts were getting stronger. She was staring at us more and more intently, and her questions were getting more direct. Her tone was more and more annoyed, as if she were trying to figure out what was really going on. Lydia, with a puzzled look, turned to me one evening at dinner and, in a relaxed tone, said, "Have you ever felt like something is missing from your life?" I was surprised by the question, and I tried to keep a neutral expression. "I think everyone has these feelings sometimes." She looked at me, and I could tell she was trying to understand. I am. One evening at dinner, she looked at me and said, "Have you ever felt like something is missing from your life?" I was surprised and didn't know how to respond. She continued, "Everyone has these feelings sometimes." I smiled and said, "Are you happy?" I felt like I had to smile, but I wasn't sure what she wanted to know. "I have a fulfilling life, Lydia. I'm thankful for everything I have," I said. She didn't say anything for a moment, and I could tell she was looking closely at me. It felt like she could see inside me. "I felt curious about your contentment. If you are fulfilled, I smile." But her question made me nervous. "I have had a fulfilling life, Lydia. I am thankful for everything I have." She didn't say anything, and her eyes narrowed as she looked at me. It felt like she could see my thoughts and feelings. The conversation continued, but the tension remained. It was like an oppressive quiet that hung over us like a storm. I knew that Lydia's doubts were growing, and she was starting to put the pieces of the truth together. I understood that if I didn't end my relationship with her, I understood that if I didn't end my relationship with Peter, the fragile balance we had maintained would completely collapse that night. I stayed awake, consumed with shame and fear. I knew that my feelings for Peter were wrong, and they were putting my life and my daughter's relationship at risk. I couldn't stop thinking about Peter. I felt ashamed and scared. I knew that I shouldn't be attracted to him because it would mess up my life with my daughter. But I also felt like I couldn't live without him. In the morning, I decided to leave. I would take my things and go home. I thought that would be the best way to deal with all of this. I decided to leave Peter, even though it would be hard. I would go home and try to be calm. But I heard a doorbell ring, and when I opened the door, it was Peter. He looked sad, and he said, "Vivian," but I could barely hear him. I was in a difficult relationship with Lydia. I felt a sense of finality and bittersweet satisfaction. I was about to leave, but Peter was at the door. He looked upset, and he said, "Please don't leave." I shook my head and didn't cry. Peter said that this was the only way he could make Lydia stop hurting him. He held out his hand, and I took it. His touch felt nice and familiar, but I wondered how our relationship was. I looked at him, and my heart, "We must let go of our desires and feelings to protect the people we love." He nodded, looking a little sad. When I closed the door, I felt a strong sense of finality, and I felt happy and sad at the same time. I understood that leaving was the only choice. Shattering at times, we must let go of our desires and feelings for others to protect the people we love. He nodded, looking a bit okay with it. When I closed the door, I felt like it was the end, and I felt happy and sad at the same time. I knew that leaving was the only way to keep Lydia safe. I wanted to keep our connection, but as I got ready for bed, I couldn't stop feeling like I was losing a part of myself. In the next few days, the house was really quiet. I decided to stay a few more days, partly because I felt guilty and partly because Peter asked me to. He said that Lydia was less stressed since I got there. But every moment was very stressful. Lydia's glances became sharper, her questions more direct, and I decided to stay a few more days, partly because I felt bad, and partly because Peter said that Lydia had been less stressed since I arrived. But every moment was very stressful. Lydia's glances became sharper, her questions more direct, and every word seemed like an examination, an attempt to reveal something that Peter and I weren't ready for. One evening, after dinner, Lydia suddenly said, "Mom, I want to talk to you privately." Peter and I looked at each other, and I agreed to let Lydia go into the. After dinner, Lydia suddenly said, "Mom, I want to talk to you in private." Peter and I looked at each other, worried, but I agreed to let her go into the living room. She closed the door and sat down. I tried to stay calm and asked, "Is everything okay, dear?" Lydia breathed deeply and sat on the couch. Her eyes didn't move. "Mom, I can't avoid this anymore. I know that something is wrong, something has been going on. I can see how you two look at each other, and how Peter has changed. It feels like there's tension between you." What she said hit me like a punch to the stomach. I tried to say something, but I couldn't find the words. She had noticed everything that was wrong. "I've noticed a change in the way you and Peter interact. There's tension between you," and her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to respond, but I couldn't find the right words. "Lydia," I started to speak, but my voice got weak. She said again that nothing is happening between you and my husband. Even though I wanted to deny it, her words stayed with me. I tried to hide my feelings. "Lydia," I started to speak, but I couldn't. "I said that nothing happened between you and my husband. You said that nothing is happening between you and my husband." I wanted to say that wasn't true, but I couldn't. I knew that Lydia, my smart daughter, would notice if I was lying. I was nervous, and my hands were shaking as I put them together. Maybe I misunderstood her words. She spoke softly, but her eyes showed that she was determined. "I can't ignore my feelings anymore. I felt distant from my marriage." My heart broke when I heard those words, and when I reached out, she moved away. Her eyes showed that she was determined. "Mother, I don't need you to explain. I need the truth." I took a deep breath, barely able to hear myself. "Lydia, I'm sorry this happened, it's complicated." She shook her head, her face showing disbelief. "You are my mother, he is my spouse." The silence between us felt like an abyss. I tried to explain how I felt alone and the accidental connection I'd made, but when I looked into her eyes, I realized. "I need some time to think about this," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to figure out what this means for us." She walked over to the door, her steps faltering just before she left. She looked at me, her eyes full of anger and sadness. "I'm your mother, and he's my husband," she said. "We can't just ignore this. I need time to think about what this means. I put my trust in you, and you tricked me." The door closed behind her, leaving me in the room. Silence. I felt overwhelmed by her words. I sank into the couch. My heart felt heavy because I had hurt something forever. Lydia left the next morning, quickly explaining. "I put my trust in you, but you let me down." The door closed, leaving me alone in the room. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of her words. I sank onto the couch. My heart felt heavy from the realization that I had hurt someone forever. Lydia left the next morning, quickly explaining that she needed space. Peter and I were left alone, with the effects of our mistakes still between us, like ghosts. I could barely look at him. Shame and regret filled every conversation we had. We moved through the house as if we were strangers. The warmth and connection that once connected us was gone. We no longer felt connected. One evening, Peter approached me in the living room. He looked tired. He said, "I'm sorry. I never wanted this to hurt you, Lydia." I looked at him, understanding the pain he was feeling. Peter came up to me in the tranquil living room that evening. He looked tired. He said, "I'm really sorry. I never wanted this to hurt you, Lydia. I never wanted any of this to hurt you." I looked at him, feeling the weight of what had happened in the past. "It's too late for apologies, Peter. We both knew what could happen." He agreed, but looked away. "I don't know what to do next. I feel like I have failed at everything." I sighed. My voice was filled with a deep sadness that sometimes. "I'm overwhelmed by the weight of past events. It's too late for apologies, Peter. We both knew the risks." He agreed, but looked away. "I'm not sure what to do next. I feel like I have failed. Everything feels overwhelming. We make decisions that can't be changed. Peter, these decisions change everything." Silence hung between us, full of regret. I knew our connection was real and made us feel less empty, but that didn't make it okay. It just changed the suffering we caused. I decided that it would be better for me to leave. I felt like I couldn't stay anymore. Peter didn't disagree, but he just nodded, looking far away as if he agreed that this was the only choice. I went back home, and my heart was heavy from all the memories. I had destroyed Lydia, and I rarely spoke to her. In the next few weeks, her silence was deep and painful. I tried to contact her through messages and letters, but she rarely replied, and her replies showed that she felt betrayed. Time went slowly. I had destroyed Lydia, and I rarely communicated with her. In the next few weeks, her silence was deep and painful. I tried to contact her through messages and letters, but she rarely replied. She was still hurt by what I did. Time went slowly. Each day, as one day turned into the next, I worked hard to feel better. I tried to forget about the loss by doing tasks and following my routine. But I still felt the pain of what I lost. One evening, months after I returned, I received a letter from Lydia. Her words: I tried to live each day as it came, but I felt sad and empty. I worked hard to feel better, but I still felt sad. One evening, a few months after I returned, I got a letter from Lydia. She wrote a short letter, but it was serious. I thought it would happen, but I was also happy to see that she was a kind of daughter I used to know. I don't know if I will ever understand what happened between you and Peter, or if I will ever be able to. I tried to understand you completely. I want to think that our connection is more important than one mistake, and that it can last. I need time. I ask for your patience. Her comments made me feel hopeful and sad. I knew that the path to. I'm trying to understand you. I don't want us to be defined by one mistake. I think our connection is important, and I want it to last. I need time. I ask for your patience. Her comments made me feel hopeful and sad. I knew it would be hard to forgive, and it would take a long time to heal the wounds I caused. But I was ready to wait to regain the trust that was broken. Over time, Lydia and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. We never talked about the betrayal, but we were also not silent about it. Forgiveness would be hard. It would take years for the wounds I caused to heal, but I was ready to wait. Over time, I would regain the trust that had been broken. Lydia and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. We never talked about the betrayal, but we understood each other. We both knew how painful it was and how we had both healed. Peter and Lydia divorced shortly after I left. Their marriage couldn't survive our actions. I learned from mutual friends that Peter moved to a small coastal town. He wanted a new beginning without the weight of his past mistakes. I found a new sense of purpose in my work. I dedicated myself to the art gallery. I put all my energy into my work. I found comfort in the creative expression that it was a safe place for me for many years. I learned to forgive myself and accept the decisions I made and the results of those decisions. But I still felt a little sad about the memories. I felt better when I realized that I had grown and learned. I made mistakes and caused sadness to the people I loved, but I found the strength to face the truth, fix my mistakes, and fix the relationship with Lydia. It could never be the same as before, but it became a real relationship shaped by suffering and understanding, which was enough.